At my husband's funeral, they handed me a name tag that said guest, and no one thought that was strange. I turned it over in my fingers for a moment, tracing the smooth white card as if there might have been a mistake printed on the other side. Something that would correct the quiet insult, but there was nothing, just that single word in elegant black script, guest, as though the last 46 years of my life had been a temporary visit that had finally expired. I pinned it to my black dress anyway, carefully, precisely, the way I had done everything in my life, and then I lifted my chin and walked into the chapel without saying a word. The room was filled with soft organ music and the low murmur of voices, polished shoes against marble floors, expensive perfume hanging faintly in the air. Everything arranged to look respectful, dignified, controlled, and yet beneath it all there was something else, something colder, like a current running just under the surface. People turned to look at me as I entered, their expressions shifting almost too quickly to catch, sympathy flickering into something else, something closer to calculation, as if they were trying to measure what I was worth now that my husband was gone. I had seen that look before, though never directed at me, not until today. My son, Daniel, stood near the front, his hand resting lightly on his wife's back, his posture straight, composed, as though he had practiced this moment in a mirror, and when our eyes met, he hesitated, just for a second, before offering me a small nod that felt more polite than personal. Vanessa didn't hesitate at all. She smiled at me, warm and polished, the kind of smile that photographs well, the kind that convinces strangers everything is exactly as it should be, and then she turned back to the guests, continuing her quiet conversations, guiding people, placing them, orchestrating the entire morning as if she had always belonged at the center of it. I moved down the aisle slowly, aware of every step, every glance, every whisper that softened just as I passed, and I noticed the seating arrangement before I even reached the front. The first row was filled, not with me, not with his wife, but with Daniel and Vanessa, with distant relatives, with business associates who barely knew him, and there was a small card placed halfway down the second row with my name written on it in that same careful script, Margaret Whitmore, positioned just far enough away to be respectful, just far enough to be invisible. I sat where they had placed me. I folded my hands in my lap. I listened as people approached, one after another, offering quiet condolences that all sounded the same, their voices gentle, their words rehearsed, and yet threaded through each conversation was a subtle assumption, an unspoken question about what would happen to me now, how I would manage, whether I would be able to keep the house, whether I would need help. Vanessa answered most of those questions for me before I even had the chance to speak, her tone soft, reassuring, explaining that everything would be taken care of, that Daniel and she were already looking into next steps, that I wouldn't have to worry about anything, and I nodded politely, allowing her words to settle into the air as though they were true. I kept my voice steady, my expression calm, my movements deliberate, because there was something almost fascinating about the way they all looked at me, as if I had already been reduced to a problem that needed solving, a responsibility that needed managing, a quiet burden that had to be handled with care. No one asked what I knew. No one asked what my husband had left behind. No one asked about the documents I had signed, the accounts I had managed, the decisions we had made together over decades. They simply assumed. And I let them. I let Vanessa guide the conversations. I let Daniel avoid my eyes. I let the guests whisper and speculate and offer their carefully measured sympathy, because correcting them would have been so easy, just a single sentence, a quiet clarification, a simple truth spoken at the right moment, but I didn't say it, not then, not when they looked at me with that particular mixture of pity and dismissal, not when Vanessa gently touched my arm and suggested we talk later about what would be best for me. I just sat there, still and composed, listening to the organ music swell and fade, watching the sunlight filter through the tall windows, and I thought about how strange it was that an entire room full of people could misunderstand something so completely, how they could build an entire narrative around a single assumption and never once question it. Because the truth was, I wasn't a guest in that room, and I certainly wasn't a woman left with nothing. But they believed I was. And for now, that was exactly what I wanted. The reception afterward unfolded exactly as I expected, though I doubted any of them realized how predictable they had become. Conversations drifted in low, careful tones, the kind people use when they believe they are being respectful, but every sentence seemed to circle back to the same quiet assumption, that I was now alone, unprotected, and most importantly, uncertain about what came next. I stood near the back of the room for a while, a glass of water in my hand, watching the way Vanessa moved from group to group with effortless confidence, her voice warm, her gestures measured, as if she had stepped into a role she had been preparing for long before today. She introduced Daniel to people as though he were already carrying the full weight of everything his father had built, her hand resting lightly on his arm, guiding him, positioning him, reinforcing an image that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. I noticed how easily he followed her lead, how quickly he deferred to her in small moments, letting her answer questions, letting her redirect conversations, letting her define the narrative that was forming around us. When someone approached me, Vanessa appeared almost immediately, her smile soft, her voice sympathetic, explaining that I had been through a great deal, that it might be best not to overwhelm me with too many details, that they were already handling the important decisions so I could focus on grieving. I thanked her each time, my tone polite, my expression calm, and I watched the relief settle over people's faces when they realized they did not need to ask me anything directly. It was easier for them that way, easier to accept the version of events that required no further questions. At one point, I overheard a conversation just behind me, two distant relatives speaking in hushed voices that were not quite as quiet as they believed. They wondered aloud whether I would sell the house, whether it would be too much for me to maintain on my own, whether Daniel and Vanessa might move in or perhaps take over entirely. The words were speculative, but the tone was certain, as if the outcome had already been decided and all that remained was the timing. I turned slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of Vanessa across the room, her posture relaxed, her smile unchanged, and I understood then that this was not something that had developed overnight. This had been building, shaping itself quietly in the background, in the spaces between conversations, in the assumptions that were never challenged. When Daniel finally approached me, his expression softened just enough to suggest concern, but there was a distance in his eyes that I could not ignore. He asked if I was holding up all right, his voice careful, measured, as though he were speaking to someone fragile, and I told him that I was fine, that everything was exactly as it needed to be. He nodded, relieved perhaps, or simply satisfied that I was not going to complicate anything, and then he mentioned that he and Vanessa would come by the house later in the week to go over a few things. His words vague, his tone casual, as if it were the most natural next step in the world. I agreed without hesitation. There was no reason not to. As he walked away, I remained where I was, listening to the steady hum of voices, watching the careful choreography of a room that believed it understood me completely. They saw a woman who had been gently set aside, someone who would accept guidance, someone who would follow rather than lead. And again, I let them believe it because there was a certain clarity that came with being underestimated, a quiet advantage that required nothing more than patience and the willingness to remain silent just a little while longer. By the time I returned home that evening, the silence felt different than it had the week before, heavier in some ways but clearer in others, as though something unspoken had finally settled into place. I set my keys down in the same small dish by the door, removed my coat carefully, and hung it in the closet where Edward had always insisted things be kept in order, and for a moment I stood there, looking at the familiar hallway, the framed photographs, the polished wood floors that still carried the faint echo of a life we had built together step by step, year by year. Nothing had changed and yet everything had. I moved into the kitchen out of habit, filling a glass with water, noticing how the late afternoon light filtered through the windows exactly as it always had, warm and steady, indifferent to everything that had unfolded earlier that day. I sat at the table and allowed myself a long, quiet breath, not out of grief, not in the way they all seemed to expect, but out of recognition, because the pattern was no longer hidden from me. It had been there for some time, subtle at first, easy to dismiss, easy to excuse. Vanessa suggesting changes during holidays that gradually shifted traditions away from me. Daniel calling less often, his visits becoming shorter, more structured, as though they had to fit within a schedule that no longer included me as a priority. Small decisions made without asking my opinion, then explained to me afterward as if they had already been agreed upon. At the time I told myself it was natural, that families evolve, that roles change, that I needed to step back and allow them to build their own life. But sitting there now, replaying the details with a clearer mind, I saw how consistent it had been, how deliberate the progression felt when viewed as a whole rather than as isolated moments. It was never one large act, never anything that could be easily confronted or named. It was a series of adjustments, each one small enough to pass without conflict, each one shifting the balance just slightly until the place I once held no longer existed in the same way. I finished my water and set the glass down with care, my movements slow and precise, and I realized that what surprised me was not what they had done, but how certain they were that I would not notice, or if I did, that I would accept it without question. There was a quiet confidence in their behavior, a certainty that they understood the situation completely, that they knew exactly where I stood and what I was capable of. I stood and walked into the living room, my gaze settling on the large desk near the window, the one Edward had used for years, the one I had begun managing after he grew tired of the details. The drawers were closed, the surface clean, everything exactly as I had left it, and I rested my hand lightly on the edge, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers. There were documents there, carefully organized, accounts that had been maintained with precision, decisions that had been made jointly, then quietly entrusted to me long before today. I had not spoken about any of it at the funeral, not when Vanessa guided conversations, not when Daniel outlined his vague plans, not when people looked at me as though I were waiting to be taken care of. I had simply listened, because there was something about certainty, about the way people behaved when they believed they had already won, that revealed far more than any direct question ever could. I moved to the window and looked out at the street, at the familiar line of trees, at the quiet stillness of the neighborhood that had once felt so full, and I allowed myself a small, measured smile, not out of amusement but out of understanding. They had already begun making plans, already begun shaping a future that placed me neatly to the side, manageable, dependent, quiet. And for now I would let them continue because there was still more I needed to see, more I needed to understand, and more importantly, there was something they had not yet realized, something they had overlooked entirely, and I intended to keep it that way at least for a little while longer. The next morning arrived with a quiet steadiness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had decided to move forward without waiting for anyone to catch up, and I followed that rhythm without resistance, waking early, making my coffee the same way I had for years, measuring carefully, allowing the familiar routine to settle my thoughts into something clear and focused. I carried my cup into the study and sat at the desk, the same desk Edward had used for decades, the one that had slowly become mine in the years before he passed, when he began trusting me with more than just small decisions, when he started saying things like, "You understand this better than I do," with a quiet certainty that had never needed to be explained. I opened the top drawer and removed a neatly organized folder, its edges aligned perfectly, each document placed with intention, not out of habit, but out of respect for the life we had built together, for the details that had mattered to both of us long before anyone else began to take an interest. I reviewed the papers slowly, not because I needed to confirm what they said, but because there was a certain clarity that came from seeing everything laid out in front of me, from tracing the decisions we had made, the accounts we had managed, the protections we had put in place without ever discussing them with anyone outside our home. There were signatures there, both his and mine, dates that stretched back years, structures that had been designed carefully, deliberately, to ensure that what we built would remain exactly where we intended it to be. I closed the folder gently and returned it to the drawer, my movements precise, controlled, and then I reached for the phone and placed a call I had not needed to make in a very long time. The line rang once before it was answered, the voice on the other end calm, professional, familiar in a way that immediately grounded the moment. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, as if he had been expecting to hear from me, as if nothing about this call was unusual. "Good morning, Mr. Collins," I replied, my tone steady, composed, because there was no need for anything else. We spoke briefly, efficiently, confirming details that did not require explanation, arrangements that had already been established long before today, and as I listened to his responses, measured and precise, I was reminded of something Edward had told me years ago, that preparation was not about expecting the worst, but about ensuring that no one else would get to decide your future for you. When the call ended, I sat there for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the phone, considering the quiet contrast between what I knew and what everyone else believed. Somewhere across town, Vanessa was likely already thinking about the week ahead, about the conversation she intended to have in this very house, about the decision she assumed would be made, and Daniel would stand beside her, perhaps uncertain, perhaps convinced, but ultimately willing to follow the path she had outlined. They would arrive with careful words, with suggestions framed as support, with plans presented as necessities, and they would expect me to listen, to agree, to accept the version of events they had constructed without ever asking whether it was true. I stood and walked through the house slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, noticing the details that had always been there, the photographs, the furniture, the quiet evidence of a life that had been lived fully and deliberately, and I understood then that nothing here was uncertain, nothing was waiting to be decided by anyone else. Everything had already been determined, documented, secured in ways that did not rely on assumption or perception. I paused by the window once more, looking out at the same street, the same trees, the same stillness that had greeted me the night before, and I felt a calm certainty settle into place, not as a reaction but as a decision. They would come, and when they did I would listen just as I had before. I would allow them to speak, to explain, to reveal exactly how much they thought they understood. And I would not interrupt, not correct, not challenge them, because there was still value in seeing how far they were willing to go, how much they were willing to assume. Silence had served me well so far, and I saw no reason to abandon it now, not when it continued to reveal more than any confrontation ever could. They arrived 3 days later, precisely at 10 in the morning, just as Vanessa had said they would, her sense of timing always exact, always intentional, and I had already been awake for hours, moving through the house in the same quiet rhythm I had established for myself, everything in its place, everything prepared without any visible effort. I heard the car pull into the driveway, the soft crunch of tires against gravel, and I did not rush to the door. Instead, I finished placing the teacups on the table, aligning them carefully, allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace, because there was no urgency on my side, no need to meet them with anything other than calm. When I finally opened the door, Vanessa smiled immediately, warm and composed, her expression perfectly arranged, while Daniel stood just behind her, holding a folder in his hand, his posture slightly rigid, as though he had rehearsed this visit in his mind more than once. "Mom," he said, his voice gentle, measured, and I stepped aside to let them in without hesitation, inviting them into the living room where the sunlight filtered in softly, illuminating everything with a quiet clarity that left little room for pretense. Vanessa complimented the house almost immediately, her eyes moving across the space with a subtle evaluation that she likely believed I would not notice, noting the details, the condition, the scale, and I thanked her politely, gesturing for them to sit as I poured tea with steady hands. There was a brief moment of silence once we were seated, the kind that often comes before something important is said, and then Vanessa began, her tone gentle, reassuring, carefully chosen to sound supportive rather than directive. She spoke about the past few days, about how difficult everything must have been for me, about how important it was to think about the future, and then almost seamlessly she transitioned into what she called practical considerations, her words flowing smoothly, as if she had already anticipated every possible response. She mentioned the size of the house, the upkeep, the responsibilities that came with managing everything alone, and she suggested that perhaps it would be easier for me to consider alternatives, something smaller, something more manageable, somewhere I could feel taken care of. Daniel nodded occasionally, adding small comments that echoed her points, his voice quieter, less certain, but aligned with hers nonetheless, and I listened to both of them without interruption, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my expression calm, my posture unchanged. When Vanessa paused, she looked at me expectantly, as though she were offering me an opportunity to agree, to confirm what she had already decided was the most reasonable course of action, and for a moment the room felt very still, as if everything hinged on what I would say next. I took a slow sip of tea before responding, allowing the silence to stretch just slightly longer than expected, and then I nodded gently, acknowledging her concern without committing to her conclusion. "That is very thoughtful of you," I said, my voice even, composed, because there was no need for anything more. Relief flickered briefly across her face, subtle but unmistakable, as if she had interpreted my response as acceptance, as confirmation that things were proceeding exactly as she had planned. Daniel relaxed slightly as well, his shoulders easing the tension, in his posture softening as he placed the folder on the table, sliding it toward me with a quiet sense of purpose. "We have been looking at a few options," he said, his tone careful, "just to make things easier for you," and I glanced at the folder without opening it, my fingers resting lightly on its surface, aware that whatever it contained had been prepared with a specific outcome in mind. I did not reach for it right away. Instead, I looked up at both of them, meeting their eyes one after the other, and I allowed a small, measured smile to form, not out of agreement, but out of understanding, because in that moment everything they believed, everything they assumed, was laid out clearly in front of me, And once again I chose not to correct them, not yet, because there was still something valuable in letting them continue, in allowing them to reveal exactly how far they intended to go before realizing what they had overlooked. I let my hand rest on the folder for a moment longer before finally opening it, not with hesitation but with intention, as though I were giving the moment exactly the weight it deserved, and inside I found neatly organized documents, printed cleanly, each page aligned with care, proposals already outlined, options already narrowed, conclusions already implied. Vanessa leaned forward slightly as I turned the first page, her attention focused, her posture composed, while Daniel watched me more cautiously, his expression searching for something in my reaction, perhaps approval, perhaps resistance, perhaps anything that would tell him how this conversation was going to unfold. The first document outlined a potential sale of the house, complete with estimated market value, timelines, and what they described as a smooth transition plan. The language polished, professional, and entirely detached from the reality of what it represented. The second document suggested several smaller properties, each described in terms of convenience and simplicity, places that were presented as suitable, manageable, appropriate for someone in my position. I read through each page slowly, not because I needed the information, but because I wanted to see how thoroughly they had constructed this narrative, how confidently they had moved forward without ever questioning whether they had the authority to do so. Vanessa spoke as I read, her voice calm, reassuring, explaining each option with a careful balance of logic and concern, emphasizing what she called peace of mind, repeating phrases that suggested this was all for my benefit, that these decisions were being made out of care rather than assumption. Daniel added occasional comments, pointing out practical details, reinforcing her points, though there was a slight hesitation in his tone, a subtle pause before he spoke, as if some part of him recognized that something about this was not entirely settled. When I reached the final page, I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table, aligning it neatly with the edge, my movements unhurried, controlled, and for a brief moment no one spoke. Vanessa waited, her expression open, expectant, confident in a way that suggested she believed the outcome was already clear, while Daniel sat quietly, his hands folded, his eyes on me, as though he were trying to read something beneath the surface that I had not yet revealed. I lifted my gaze and met theirs calmly, allowing a small pause to settle into the space between us, not to create tension, but to give weight to what I would say next. "You have both put a great deal of thought into this," I said, my voice steady, measured, because that much was true, and Vanessa smiled slightly, her shoulders relaxing just enough to signal that she believed I was moving in the direction she had anticipated. "We just want what is best for you," she replied softly, her tone warm, practiced, and I nodded again, acknowledging the sentiment without confirming it. I reached for my teacup, taking another slow sip, allowing the silence to stretch just a little longer, because there was something revealing about how quickly people filled that space when they believed they needed to guide the outcome. Vanessa began to speak again, elaborating on timelines, on next steps, on how quickly things could be arranged if we all agreed, her confidence growing with each word, while Daniel nodded beside her, his earlier hesitation fading as he settled into the structure she was providing. And I listened just as I had before, my expression unchanged, my posture steady, because the more they spoke, the clearer it became, not just what they intended to do, but how certain they were that I would follow their lead. When she finally finished, when the room grew quiet once more, I set my cup down, carefully, and folded my hands in my lap, meeting their eyes with a calm that had nothing to do with uncertainty and everything to do with understanding. "I appreciate your concern," I said evenly, and I let the words settle without adding anything further, because there was still one thing they had not asked, one detail they had not considered, one truth they had not even thought to question, and until they did, there was no reason for me to offer it. Vanessa was the first to break the silence, though this time there was a subtle shift in her tone, something slightly sharper beneath the warmth, as if my lack of immediate agreement had introduced a variable she had not fully accounted for, and she leaned forward just enough to close the distance between us, her voice still gentle, but more deliberate now, as though she needed to guide the conversation back toward a conclusion she could control. "We understand this is a lot to take in," she said, her eyes steady on mine. "But the sooner we make decisions, the easier everything will be for you." And I noticed the way she emphasized the word easier, as if complexity itself was something I could no longer manage. Daniel glanced at her briefly before looking back at me, his expression uncertain again, caught somewhere between agreement and hesitation, and for a moment, I wondered if he recognized the tone she was using or if it had already become so familiar that he no longer heard it. I did not respond right away. Instead, I allowed the quiet to return, not as resistance but as space, because there was something revealing about how quickly people tried to fill silence when they felt their control slipping. And Vanessa did not disappoint. She continued, outlining potential timelines, suggesting that listing the house within the next month would be ideal, that the market conditions were favorable, that delaying might complicate things unnecessarily, her words flowing with increasing confidence, as though each sentence strengthened the reality she was constructing. Daniel nodded again, more firmly this time, adding that it would be best to handle everything efficiently, to avoid prolonged uncertainty, and I listened to both of them with the same calm attention I had maintained from the beginning, my expression unchanged, my posture steady, because the more they spoke, the clearer their assumptions became. They were not asking what I wanted. They were explaining what they had already decided. When Vanessa finally paused, her gaze fixed on me with a quiet expectation, I shifted slightly in my chair, not out of discomfort, but to acknowledge that the moment had reached a point where a response was required, and I placed my hands lightly on the table, my fingers resting against the polished surface, grounding myself in the present rather than the narrative they were presenting. "You have both been very thorough," I said, my voice even, composed, because again that much was true, and Vanessa smiled, a small satisfied expression that suggested she believed we were approaching agreement. "We just want to make sure you are taken care of," she replied, her tone softening again, returning to that carefully constructed warmth that masked intention with concern, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her words without endorsing them. Then, for the first time since they had arrived, I asked a question, simple, direct, and entirely neutral. "What makes you think I cannot manage this house on my own?" The room shifted in that instant, not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone passing by, but in a subtle tightening of posture, a brief pause in breathing, a moment where the certainty they had been relying on faltered just enough to be noticed. Vanessa's smile remained, but it changed slightly, becoming more controlled, more deliberate, as she considered how to respond, and Daniel looked at me with a flicker of something I had not seen earlier, something closer to recognition, as though the question itself had disrupted the version of events he had accepted without fully examining. "It is not about whether you can," Vanessa said carefully, choosing her words with precision. "It is about what is best for you at this stage." And I nodded slowly, absorbing the answer without reacting, because it told me exactly what I needed to know. They had already placed me in a category, already defined my limitations, already decided what my future should look like, and they had done so without ever considering that I might see things differently. I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing a small, measured smile to return, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, because in that moment, their perspective was no longer an assumption to me, it was a certainty, and certainty I had learned was far easier to work with than uncertainty. Vanessa held my gaze for a moment longer, as if weighing whether to adjust her approach or continue forward with the same certainty, and in the end, she chose to continue, her posture straightening slightly, her tone returning to that calm, measured confidence that had carried her through the entire conversation. "We are only trying to make things simpler for you," she said, her voice smooth, controlled, as though simplicity itself was the ultimate goal, something universally desirable, something no reasonable person would refuse. Daniel nodded beside her, more firmly now, as if aligning himself fully with the direction she had set, and I watched him closely, not with disappointment, not even with surprise, but with a quiet clarity that had taken years to develop, because this was not a sudden shift, not a moment of betrayal that had appeared out of nowhere, but the natural outcome of choices made gradually, consistently, over time. I let a small silence settle between us again, not as a challenge but as an acknowledgement, and then I reached forward and gently closed the folder, sliding it back toward Daniel with a calm, deliberate motion that carried no hesitation. "You have given me a great deal to think about," I said evenly, my voice steady, because that was what they expected to hear, something neutral, something that suggested consideration without resistance, and Vanessa's expression softened immediately, her shoulders relaxing just enough to signal that she believed the conversation was moving back into familiar territory. "Of course," she replied, her tone warm again, almost reassuring, as though she had successfully guided me back to where I belonged in her version of events. Daniel exhaled quietly, a subtle release of tension that did not escape my notice, and he reached for the folder, placing it back in his lap with a sense of quiet resolution, as if the outcome had already begun to take shape in his mind. I stood slowly, smoothing my hands over the front of my dress, not out of nervousness but out of habit, and I walked toward the window for a moment, looking out at the street, allowing the stillness outside to mirror the calm I had maintained throughout the conversation. Behind me I could feel their attention shift, waiting, expecting something more, perhaps a question, perhaps a concern, perhaps a sign that I needed their guidance to move forward. Instead, I turned back to them with the same composed expression I had worn since they arrived, my gaze steady, my posture relaxed, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging their presence without yielding to their assumptions. "I will review everything carefully," I said, my tone measured, deliberate, giving each word its place, because there was a certain precision in language that could not be misunderstood if chosen correctly. Vanessa smiled again, satisfied, interpreting my response exactly as I intended her to, as agreement deferred rather than agreement denied, and she rose from her seat, smoothing her own dress with a practiced motion that mirrored mine, though for entirely different reasons. Daniel stood as well, his movements less deliberate, more reactive, and he offered a small nod. His expression settled now into something that resembled quiet confidence. They believed they had taken the first step. They believed the direction had been set. They believed that what remained was simply a matter of time and execution. I walked them to the door, my pace unhurried, my demeanor unchanged, and as Vanessa stepped outside, she turned back with one final reassuring smile, the kind that suggested everything was under control, that everything was proceeding exactly as it should. "We will talk again soon," she said, her voice light, certain, and I returned the smile just as gently, just as composed, because there was no need to contradict her. "Yes," I replied softly, "we will." I closed the door behind them with a quiet, deliberate motion, the sound of the latch settling into place marking the end of the conversation, and I remained there for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the wood, listening to the fading sound of their car as it pulled away. The house grew still again, the silence returning not as emptiness but as space, and I turned back toward the study without hesitation, my steps steady, my thoughts clear, because now that I had seen everything I needed to see, now that I understood exactly what they believed and how far they were willing to go, there was only one thing left to do, and it did not require urgency, it did not require confrontation, it required only timing, and timing, I had learned, was everything. I did not go to the study immediately, not because I needed more time, but because I understood the value of letting a moment settle before acting on it. So I moved through the house once more, slowly, deliberately, allowing the quiet to reaffirm what I already knew. The same walls, the same photographs, the same carefully chosen details that had once been shared now stood as quiet witnesses to something much clearer than before. Not loss but revelation. I paused at the dining room table, the one where we had hosted countless dinners, where decisions had been made without ever needing to be announced, where Edward and I had built a life that did not depend on anyone else's approval, and I rested my hand lightly on the back of the chair he used to sit in, not out of longing but out of acknowledgement. He had never been careless. Not with his work, not with his decisions, and certainly not with me. When I finally entered the study, I did so with the same steady pace, the same calm precision that had guided me from the beginning, and I sat at the desk, opening the drawer without hesitation, retrieving the folder that had remained exactly where I had placed it. This time I did not review the documents slowly. There was no need. I turned directly to the pages that mattered, the ones that defined everything they had overlooked, the ones that existed long before Vanessa had begun outlining her plans, long before Daniel had started assuming his role without question. The signatures were clear. The structure was intentional. The ownership was not ambiguous. I closed the folder again and set it down with quiet certainty, because the truth had never been hidden from me, only from them. I reached for the phone once more and made a second call, my tone just as composed as before, confirming what had already been arranged, ensuring that the next step would unfold exactly as intended, not rushed, not forced, but precise. When I ended the call, I remained seated for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the desk, considering not what I needed to do, but when. They would expect time. They would expect hesitation. They would expect me to review their suggestions, to weigh their options, to slowly arrive at the conclusion they had already chosen for me. And I would give them exactly that. Or at least the appearance of it, because there was a difference between delay and preparation, and I had learned to use that difference well. Later that afternoon, I received a message from Daniel, brief and polite, asking if I had any initial thoughts about the plans they had discussed, and I read it once, then set the phone aside without responding immediately, not out of avoidance but out of intention. When I did reply, it was simple, measured, exactly what he expected. I told him I needed a little time, that I appreciated their effort, that I would be in touch soon. There was comfort in that kind of response, reassurance in its neutrality, and I knew it would settle any remaining uncertainty on their side. They would believe everything was proceeding as planned. They would continue preparing, continue assuming, continue building a future that did not belong to them. And I would allow it, because the moment they realized the truth would not come from explanation, it would come from contrast, from the undeniable clarity of reality placed directly in front of them, leaving no room for interpretation. I stood and walked back toward the window, the same place I had paused before, the same quiet view stretching out beyond the glass, unchanged and steady, and I felt no urgency, no pressure, only a calm, deliberate certainty. They had already decided who I was. They had already written the ending in their minds. And for now, I would let them believe it, because sometimes the most powerful move is not the one you make immediately, but the one you make when everyone else is absolutely certain there is nothing left to reveal.